morning, good afternoon and good evening to our geographically scattered audience. It's with immense happiness that I welcome you all to the first event of the Monterey Summer Symposium on Russia and what will be an excellent keynote discussion panel on the world in 2021, where we will grapple with some of the big geopolitical questions of our age. But before that, I would like to address a few words to the MSSR Fellows and to briefly introduce myself. My name is Jade McGlynn. I'm Director of Research and Russian Studies at Henry Jackson Society, a London think tank, and I'm a tutor in the Humanities Division at Oxford University. Prior to this, I was a lecturer in Russian, also at Oxford, where I completed my PhD after living in Russia for 5 years. It was during my PhD in 2018 that I had the privilege of being selected as an MSSR Fellow in California, back in the days when you were still allowed to travel. I know that it sounds corny, but it's true when I say that this experience was a life-changing one for me. Having lived in Russia from 2011 to 2015, I was already well aware that most Russian analysts and people had a different perspective of events happening at that time from Western analysts. And on many occasions, I didn't agree with my Russian colleagues. But on returning to the UK and spending time in the US East Coast, one thing that shocked me was how one-sided Western debates on Russia had become. They were no longer debates, they were more like polyphonic monologues. There was a conflation between bad faith disinformation and genuinely holding a different point of view, where anything that fell outside of orthodox lines could just be dismissed. The consequence has not been to enrich our understanding of Russia in the West, or of course to prepare our future experts to understand the various strands of thinking within Russia and within the Russian government on the key issues facing the world today. To understand is not to agree, it's to be informed. I came to MSSR at a time when the privileging of partisanship over discussion was perhaps at a peak in our field, and I felt quite lonely as a scholar. MSSR restored my faith in what an educational experience can be, challenging. Here over the next 2 months, you'll hear from speakers that you vehemently disagree with, speakers whose views are a comfort blanket, and speakers who will completely change your mind. And that really is what education and engagement should and must be about, and it's what sums up MSSR. Well, with that and the force of nature that is Anna Borisovna, the kindest woman I will ever meet, and probably you will ever meet, beautiful inside and out, and a true individual, committed to young people, to developing a respect for education and for peace in an era when both are too lightly dismissed. The successes here, the excellent cadres of experts and of fellows are only possible because of her tireless work, dedication, and intelligence. On this note, you are of course here to hear from the experts, and it's high time that we moved on to the keynote discussion. We're incredibly lucky to be joined by a feast, really, of expertise. And I'd like to start with by introducing Dr. Richard Haass, who is a veteran diplomat and an established leader of non-profit institutions. He's in his 18th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations and an independent non-partisan membership organization, think tank, publisher, and educational institution dedicated to being a resource to helping people better understand the world and foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. We're also joined by Dr. Thomas Gomart, who is the director of the French Institute of International Relations, known as IFRI, and he's served there also as director of strategic development from 2010 to 2015, and he founded and directed IFRI's Russia NIS Center. He holds a PhD in the history of international relations from Paris, Pantheon-Sorbonne, and an EMBA from HEC in Paris. We're also lucky to be joined by Dr. Fedor Lukyanov, who is chairman of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy, the oldest Russian NGO, providing expertise in the foreign policy field, and editor-in-chief of Russia in Global Affairs, a journal that I'm sure you all know. He is also a research director at the International Valdai Discussion Club and a member of the Presidium of the RIAC, so the Russian International Affairs Council. We also have Dr. Dongxiao Chen, who is the president of the Shanghai Institute for International Studies. He specializes in the studies of the United Nations, China's foreign policy, and China-US relations. He's led numerous research projects commissioned by the Chinese National Foundation of Social Sciences, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Finance, and the Taiwan Affairs Office of State Council, as well as publishing extensively on UN reform and China's multilateral diplomacy. And then finally, last but very, very much not least, we have Dr. Tao Xie, who is the Dean of the School of International Relations and Diplomacy at the Beijing Foreign Studies University. He holds a PhD in political science from Northwestern University, and his primary research interests are American politics and Chinese-US relations, on which he's published extensively in both English and Chinese. Dr. Richard Haass will speak first, delivering the keynote speech, and then we will have a broader panel discussion for 45 minutes or so until 1:45, the various hours in which we're all keeping to. And at that point, we'll have the audience Q&A. Unfortunately, Dr. Haass must leave us after 1 hour, so if we could please prioritize questions to him first, that would be great. If you do have a question in the final 45 minutes, please raise your hand on Zoom and I will come to you. Now, with the housekeeping done, perhaps Dr. Haass, I could hand over to you for your introductory comments.
Well, thank you, Jade, and it's always good to be handed over from a fellow Oxonian. Good to see you here. What an extraordinary grouping you've pulled together, Anna. So thank you so much. I'm going to be short. I'd really much rather hear from and learn from everybody on this panel. This really is an impressive group, and I think I know everybody. So I look forward to their comments. I will do my best to set the stage, what the Brits would call setting the buffet, as we Americans might say. So how to understand the world in 2021. I think the first thing to say, given where we are, is the prominence and the power of global challenges. We are living with and dying from one of them, which is COVID-19, a pandemic that had its origins in China, whatever the specific origins, that has spread throughout the rest of the world. And for better, and in this case for worse, it shows the power of globalization. Nothing stays local for long. What began in Wuhan, again, however it began, did not stay in Wuhan. So we're seeing that manifestation of globalization. And here as elsewhere, what we're seeing is the gap between a global challenge and the machinery that exists to deal with it. In this case, the World Health Organization was simply unable or unwilling or both to meet the challenge. International arrangements for everything from the sharing of special equipment to ultimately the sharing of vaccines is seriously and woefully inadequate. So to get ahead of myself, one of my themes is that we use the phrase all the time, international community, and alas, it's aspirational rather than a reflection of reality. This is not unique to global health challenges. It's obviously just as prevalent in something like climate change, where we're seeing climate change steadily march ahead. The metaphor of a slow melting ice cube is both literal and representational. That is, and again, the ability and willingness of the world to come together to meet this challenge, which has local manifestations, but it is a collective global challenge. The gap between Paris and other arrangements and what is needed to be done is large and growing. I could go through a whole list of other global arrangements. I'd add one more to the beginning, which is cyberspace, vital to our economies, our societies, our politics, our militaries. Yet the analogy I tend to use is it reminds me of cowboy movies. 150 years ago in my own country, where you have a lot of people with guns riding horses, and there's very few laws and no sheriffs to enforce them. And that is the world of cyberspace, where you have state and non-state actors, again, where things can come from anywhere and affect everywhere. And I could go through a long list of other examples of globalization. We're about to mark the 20th anniversary of 9/11 in my country, which was a manifestation of global terrorism. We struggle with proliferation of various issues. There's trade, there's monetary and other issues. Again, what is so striking to me, and I would just make it my first point, is the reality that we are living in an era in which global challenges are perhaps the defining set of challenges of this era of history. And it's hard not to be struck or conclude that the machinery, the institutions, the rules, the laws, the norms, the enforcement mechanisms are inadequate in every single domain of international relations. So one way to think about the future is, can we narrow the gap between the challenges and the arrangements? And I think that is, for me, one of the principal issues in our field. And I would simply say the field is disappointed. The politics are disappointed and the field is disappointed. If one looks at some of the creative work done in the aftermath of World War II, I don't see anything as creative or as effective following the end of the Cold War 3 decades ago. I do not think there has been a particularly successful response to the contemporary challenges of globalization. We can talk about why, if you'd like. Secondly, and it's related to this, is we're living in an era that even though we still have great powers, and I'll come to that in a minute, we are living in an era in which power is more broadly distributed than in any other moment in history. The word I like to use for it is non-polarity. You could use extreme multipolarity. But the point is simply that various forms of power, military, economic, and other, are in more hands. And the hands are not simply nation states. It could be major corporations, say in the technology space. It could be NGOs in the public health space. It could be regional organizations, international organizations, nation states in the Middle East. It could be non-state actors like Hezbollah, Hamas, and other such entities. But we're living at a period of history where power is more broadly distributed than ever before. And as you might expect, it reinforces where I began, the difficulty in fashioning effective regional and global responses. It's just harder to bring together groupings which are so large and disparate. And that is simply a fact of life in today's world. Centrifugal forces are quite powerful as a result. Now, as if this were all enough, we're not, as all this were not enough, this combination of globalization and the distribution of power, we also do have a revival of great power rivalry. Hopes when the Cold War ended that some of the principal dynamics of history would come to an end at the same time have not been proven true. We see it on every level. We see it in terms of Russia. We see it in terms of China, both with the United States as well as with others. We also see it, by the way, and it's really a little bit beyond the subject of this, but I just mentioned it, in terms of how societies and countries ought to organize themselves to deal with economic and social issues. But in my own country, in the United States, for example, we're having enormous debates about the role of the government in the economy. And we're also having enormous debates about the proper role of the government in the society. And you're seeing similar debates in China and other countries, different debates, but still fundamental debates about how to design modern economies and modern societies to deal with all the pressures. But my point is simply to say that there has been a revival of great power rivalry. I expect we will discuss why, but it's manifested itself in one way with Russia, which violated, I would say, one of the most fundamental norm that exists in international relations, which is the non-acquisition of territory by force, obviously in Crimea, and is using force in eastern Ukraine as well as in Georgia. And Russia more broadly finds itself at odds with the United States and many others over such things as the use of cyberspace over human rights, again, over the use of military force in Europe and the Middle East. And my point is not to pick a fight, though I'm happy to have arguments, simply to say that great power rivalry has emerged. We can argue or discuss how we got to this point, to what extent this was because of dynamics within Russia, to what extent this was because of dynamics in the West, or some combination of the two. But as somebody once said, we are where we are, where we are. And going forward, the question is, how do we manage this growing rivalry? And second of all, how do we manage it in a way that not only limits the friction between the United States and Russia and others, particularly in Europe, but so it does not preclude an ability or a willingness to work together on global issues. And I would say the same thing about China. China is a more multidimensional power than Russia. It has the full-fledged international economy. It's integrated in the world economically, incomparably more than Russia. It's got 9 or 10 times the population of Russia. So China is an emerging power on a different scale than Russia. Though again, I don't mean to disparage or diminish Russia, given its nuclear capability, its position in the UN Security Council, its military, its economic, its cyber capability. Simply say that China does have an extra dimension, which is a full-fledged international economy. And the question is, what is China's view of international order? What is China willing to do in the world? What is its definition of success? What sorts of institutions or arrangements or norms is it prepared to support? And the recent evidence is not encouraging. If one looks at what's going on inside China with Hong Kong or Xinjiang, or the refusal to cooperate in the investigation on Wuhan, if one looks at what China is doing on its border with India, the pressure China is putting on Taiwan, Japan, and so forth, it raises fundamental questions as to what is China prepared to do with its growing power. And again, what is China's vision of order in the 21st century? And so I'll just sort of end with the notion that I think we're living at a point where there is no commonality or consensus on how to deal with regional and global issues. There is no consensus on norms about what ought to take place within countries. No consensus on how to deal with these global challenges. And I think this is true as well of the United States. There's debates within the United States about all these issues, and there's debates, and as a result, it's often led to some inconsistency in American foreign policy. So my point is not to present the United States here as the one country that has her quote unquote right. It's simply that we're living in an era of again a gap between what the major powers are doing and what global challenges call for. And we could have a very dangerous overlay of what you might call traditional frictions, the stuff of 20th century foreign policy, overlaid on the stuff of 21st century foreign policy, which is disagreements over what order, how do we ought to structure the international system. So I actually think this is a worrisome time in history. My own view is if you're not worried, you're not paying attention. But we have reached a point where if 30 years ago when the Cold War ended and you would describe the world that we have today as likely or inevitable, you would have been seen as, I believe, unduly pessimistic. It would have been seen as an overly sober or negative projection of the future. Yet that's where we are. So I think it's useful to discuss perhaps how we got here. I'd love to hear competing ideas about whether my picture of the world is wrong. And to the extent that we do overlap, views about how do we move forward? How do we both reduce the heat in US-Russian and US-Chinese relations? And second of all, how do we narrow the gap between global challenges and global responses? Because I really do think ultimately the character of the 21st century is going to be largely determined by our responses to those two questions. So Jade, why don't I stop there?
Thank you so much, Dr. Haass, for such a wonderful introduction, especially to such an expansive topic. And you've picked up on several issues, for example, climate change early on, that I know the MSSR fellows are going to be spending a couple of days looking at during the program, but also this lack of political, international political imagination to find solutions, and also some of the forces that are driving some of the divisions. And on this, I really want to turn to Dr. Gomart, because it makes me think about your book, Guerre Invisible. And my question for you is, what are the invisible wars that will shape geopolitics in this century?
Thank you, Jade. Before answering, I would like to thank obviously the Monterey Symposium for invitations. That's very good to see many good friends around this virtual roundtable. And also my thanks to Anna Vassilieva for her invitation. And it's a way for me to refer to the memory of Thérèse Delpech, a good friend of all of us. Jade, to respond to your question very briefly, I have 4 points. The first one is maybe to try to describe roughly the global situation in which we are, which depends, on my view, on the convergence between two trends. The first one is the environmental degradation, and the second one is the technological propagation. And you have basically this idea, which is understood differently if you are seated in the US, in China, in Russia, or in Europe. You have basically this idea that the second trend should be the answer to the first trade. And personally, I'm not sure of that, because I do think that our capability to transform the world are much more higher than our capability to anticipate this transformation. So this convergence, these two trends are, in my view, the landscape in which all of us should try to think about. Second, there is a very particular positioning of China in the US in this landscape, given the fact that both countries represent more than 40% of total global CO2 emission. That means that, in my view, these two countries try to reinvent capitalism with a sort of, I would say, environmental productivism. This idea that to go green is in fact the new way to reinvent capitalism. But doing so, they are subordinating their climate policy and their digital policy to their strategic rivalry. And that's a big difference, in my view, with, for instance, Europeans that certainly thought differently in Russia. Third point, I do think that we are facing a sort of overlap between two things. I would say the geopolitics of oil. When I say geopolitics of oil, that's geopolitics of fossil resources, oil, gas, coal, and so on, which is very well known by all of us. And this geopolitics was, to some extent, set up after the First World War. And we have an overlap of that, which is still very critical, very important, with a sort of geopolitics of data, which is much more difficult to be understood. And I think that's all we have to think about in terms of grid power competition should be tried to be analyzed in this overlapping. And fourth point, you kindly refer to my last book, Guerre Invisible, and I wrote this book, last year to try to respond 20 years after the publication of Unrestricted Warfare, which was published in China by two very important officers. And this book 20 years ago listed 24 types of warfare, coming from nuclear war to environmental war or to sanitary war. And I think that this book is highly important to understand the transformation, especially in the West, the transformation of the, I would say, strategic grammar we are facing. The two authors listed, as I said, 24 types of warfare, but said something very important in terms of analyzing grid power competition. They said that the militaries lost their monopoly on conflicts, which doesn't mean that that's the end of the importance of military, but which is a way to try to think about the overlapping between different types of power competition. I stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gomart. That was a wonderful answer. And I mean, you're talking about these quite tectonic transformations, and within them, it seems that we're all very agreed that there will be an increasing multipolarity, and not just between nation states, as Dr. Haass said. And I would like now to turn to Dr. Lukyanov to ask whether or not you think this increasing multipolarity will push the USA and Russia into greater rivalry or into greater engagement.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jade. Thank to all of those who came, and of course to organizers, because it's an unbelievable pleasure to see all of you and to discuss all these interesting things. The brilliant presentation of Dr. Haass, and it normally pushes us to try to not just respond, but also to try to understand for ourselves how it works in reality, because I'm afraid each of us, we know how to explain things to other people, but when being asked whether we understand ourselves, that's another issue, another question. Okay, as for multipolarity, I think that the answer is both. Of course, this new and very rapidly emerging international environment is pushing us towards all possible directions at the same time. This is the very new phenomenon, and we need to learn how to live with that. Certainly, there are issues which are increasing competition, and the Russian-American case is maybe not very much typical, because we have, fortunately or unfortunately, a long story behind us. And this story partially is very tragic, and it brings us all the time, over and over again to this trajectory of confrontation. At the same time, as we saw recently during Putin-Biden summit in Geneva, at least we have something to start with. And strategic stability issues, with the certain exception of Donald Trump presidency, Mr. Trump and his entourage were totally disinterested in this issue, which normally was the foundation for Soviet/Russian-American relationship since basically 50s. So now we are back to a more normal situation when both sides understand responsibility for at least this area. And that brings a bit of hope for some kind of cooperation or interaction in months and years to come, starting from this, maybe moving a little bit further without big illusions about possibilities. At the same time, of course, the competitive nature of today's international environment is obvious. And we can find a lot of particular reasons in Russia, in the US, in China, in Europe, wherever. And all those reasons will be correct. But I think it's a much bigger picture, actually, much bigger situation, because we are witnessing end of world order, which many people after the end of the Cold War believed to be very much long-term cancellation of international system. It didn't happen for many reasons. And now we see actually a rapid increase of more chaotic, more anarchic international system, which is not new. We had this kind of international environments before. More than that, the Cold War in the post-Cold War period was rather an exemption from the history of international relations, with a very high degree of structured competition and structured relationship between different countries. So now we are moving back to normal, it does mean the normal is okay, but this normal is in a way more typical. And the question is whether in this new environment, Russia and the US, if we speak about those two entities, or all actors involved, not only biggest powers like China, EU, Russia, United States, but also those middle-sized powers which claim now to play much more important role in international affairs, much more important than they used to play before. Of course, the first example which comes to mind is Turkey, but Turkey is not alone in this role. So whether we will be able to find more or less harmonized system of international competition, which will increase and which will deepen whatever we do, because again, this approach which we had late 20th, early 21st century, that global problems must have global solutions. I think this is disappearing. And now even in the climate issue, which has been mentioned here a couple of times, I think we should not have illusions. As Thomas absolutely rightly said, this is reinvention of capitalism, but this reinvention is unique for each country or each group of countries. And that will be a very harsh competition, how to reinvent itself and ourselves and yourselves. But at the same time, the problem is global and the problem is universal. So I think this is the main challenge to us, how to maintain some kind of focus on global issues within the world, which is turning much more egoistic and selfish than it used to be, say, 10 or 15 years ago.
Thank you, Dr. Lukyanov. And on that slightly depressing note about the increasing egotism of the world, but staying on the point around multipolarity and multilateralism, I have a question for Dr. Chen, which is, how do you think that we need to reimagine multilateralism for the 21st century? I appreciate that's a hard question.
Thank you, Jade, and it's also a great honor for being invited to attend such a higher level meeting. I think that the so-called imagine or reimagine multilateralism in 21st century, because we have no global government, and there's also no so-called ideal multilateralisms in these centuries in the foreseeable future. We are always in the dilemma of trying to find a balance between among the legitimacy, efficacy, as well as solidarity of the existing international or multilateral institutions. So I think that my first point is the global governance room has been already very clouded, and we need to strike good balance between and among those legitimacy, efficacy, and solidarity. The second point is that the multilateralism for 21st century has been evolving from the progress and achievements of that in the 20th century, in which United Nations and the United Nations Charter has been playing the key role, even if it is still unsatisfactory for many reasons. But still, it holds the legitimacy of multilateralism. So it should continue to play its indispensable role of multilateralism for 21st century. My third point is that we also should focus more on inclusive and networked multilateralism. Such efforts need not only a stronger coordination of the United Nations family, and as well as many other international financial institutions, regional organizations, trading communities, and others. It also draw upon the talents and resources from civil society, local and regional authority, business, entrepreneurs, and others, and the sheer power and broadly and fairly. So in other words, such a multi-stakeholder multilateralism effort will help United Nations system keep pace with the current challenge and opportunity. My last point is that for the effective multilateralism, we still need a concert of powers, concert of big powers, particularly big powers. So in that case, we need to roll back the exclusionary rhetorics and actions, because those exclusionary rhetorics and deeds do not help solve, but only undermine the global cooperation against today's transnational and cross-border challenges, including the climate crisis, water pollution, or proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, emerging technology in the absence of agreed principles and norms. So I think that we all witnessed the growing number of issue-based coalition. They are thriving, but they should complement each other rather than served in a mutual exclusion or even a confrontation. So I think I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. Thank you. And I now have a sort of final one-to-one question for Dr. Xie, which is, what does and perhaps will the US-China strategic rivalry mean for the rest of the world?
Well, Jade, very nice to see you, and thanks for the invitation. Also very glad to see some of these very prominent scholars here, in particular, Mr. Haass. I've seen your name anywhere, everywhere, and so this is the first time for me to see you in person online. Let me try to cap my comments, 2 minutes. One is, I think everybody knows it would be catastrophe if we are seeing a US-China rivalry. We know that if you are having a rivalry, that means the relationship could fast deteriorate into adversarial, and it could become a zero-sum game. Now, when we talk about competition, in the past we say strategic competition. Competition could mean that the two parties could try to bring the best out of each other in competition, like Nike versus Adidas, right? They compete, but they're not rivalry. It's not a zero-sum game. So when if you say US-China relationship is now fast becoming a rivalry, I'm very much worried that this is fast becoming adversarial. Now, for the past couple of weeks, I've been thinking about the history of US-China relationship. I'm kind of brainstorming an article on this. And so you look at the instances where US and China cooperated. World War II, Cold War, there was an extensive strategic cooperation. And then after Cold War, you also had extensive economic cooperation between the two countries. But a defining feature of US cooperation in the past is that United States was absolutely dominant vis-a-vis China. So I think the question now for us Chinese, as well as for Americans and for the international community at large, is this big question. Is the United States willing to continue to cooperate or to accommodate China, especially when China is seemingly increasingly powerful? So in other words, in the past, the United States was willing to cooperate with China because China was relatively weak. And today, China is becoming much more powerful, especially compared with the United States. And so is the United States willing to cooperate with China? And if the United States is not willing to cooperate, I'm afraid that we are probably facing another catastrophe. So just today, I came across a book review by Francis Fukuyama for a book on, the title of the book is called 2034. Sorry, I forgot the full title, but he was basically saying a war between the United States and China in 2034 is not completely unlikely, okay? So let me end my answer here. Again, you ask me, what would this be for the rest of the world if there's a US-China rivalry? That would be catastrophe. That's the last thing we want to see. At least I think, that's nothing, the last thing that the United States or countries in Southeast Asia or in other parts of the world want to see. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Xie. You raised a lot of provoking points there. But before we move to the questions from the fellows, I'd actually like to pick up on one of your final points there and pose a question to the entire panel. So whoever so wishes, please answer. But that's about whether or not contemporary politicians and the publics in many countries have forgotten about the realities of war, and what risks does perhaps this forgetting what war is really like pose in terms of policy making? I don't know who would like to answer first.
I can say something. First of all, this is a rich conversation, something that Vartan Gregorian would have loved. So thank you all for doing it. Just makes it even sorrier and sadder that Vartan can't be with us any longer. He will be missed. The good news, by the way, Dr. Xie, is that the book 2034 is fiction. It's not nonfiction. So and one could say the goal of policymakers and policy intellectuals is to make sure it remains fiction. And the good news is nothing is inevitable in history. Nothing is, shall we say, baked into the cake here. And this is all in the realm of statecraft on the part of the various sides. I would think that the United States, you said something I just want to respond to, if it's okay, if Dr. McGlynn will allow me, which is the problem, I would say, or the challenge is not China's growing power. That's a reality. And that's a result, to a large extent, of internal dynamics in China. And what China has accomplished is impressive by any by any historical measure. The question is, to what purpose or use is China going to put its growing power? And that's where there's growing concern in the United States. And I would say, Republicans and Democrats don't agree on a lot in my country. They actually do agree in their growing shared concern about how China is using its growing power already and how it might use it in the future. So I think that is an issue. I think it was Dr. Chen, your colleague, who mentioned the idea of a concert, which is an idea that Charlie Kupchan and I put forward in a recent article in Foreign Affairs. I think that could be a useful added dimension of machinery for international relations. Happy to see it introduced. It doesn't take the place of other things, but it could certainly complement it. The other thing I was thinking, I was making notes as I was listening to you talk, is we live in a world of global challenges. And I think you all made some really interesting points about the range of potential responses to global challenges. That in many ways, global responses to global challenges may be the least important of the menu of possible ways of responding to global challenges. Regionalism is obviously in the area of trade. Increasingly, one would say regionalism is more important. In some cases, in the security realm, regional alliances are more important. Coalitions of the able and willing, and some other things. Yet in others, it might even be national responses. So one way to think about it is not simply that we need to manufacture global arrangements, which may be impossible. Increasingly in a world of 192 or 3 countries with all these other entities that have power, the idea that you could get everybody in the same room or on the same Zoom call to agree to anything is impossible. So multilateralism, which is something that Dr. McGlynn here is wanting us to talk to, quite rightly, one should not confuse multilateralism with something that looks like the UN General Assembly, which to me, it's one version and probably the least interesting, least effective version of multilateralism that exists. So rather, I think we need to look regionally and, again, selectively. And we also need to look at national performance. If you look at how the world has dealt with COVID, national performance counts probably for more than collective responses. In climate, I would say the trajectories of America's economy, China's economy, Europe's economy, and India's economy, and Japan's economy will matter much, much more than anything that's done at Paris. And again, it's not to say that global things are not important. It's just how the responses may not be from the top down.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Haass. Is there any other, Fyodor, please? Sorry, Dr. Lukyanov, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, I would love to endorse what Dr. Haass just said very much, that multilateralism doesn't mean that all should be included. And that was the idea of post-Cold War period, which didn't work. So multilateralism means that those who are interested in addressing particular issue and those who are able to do something there, they should create maybe ad hoc compositions, maybe more permanent, but on the basis of addressing a particular, very specific problem. And that have chances to work much better than attempts to engage with everybody. At the end of the day, yes, it's not necessarily a General Assembly, which is the worst case example, but maybe like international conventions when where everybody agrees, but no one does anything. And second observation, I think it's important to discuss in today's environment. I follow very closely what administration of President Biden is doing. And I must say, I'm very impressed by the quality and the professionalism of this administration. I mean, the foreign policy and security team. And I think this administration is very much committed to the idea to bring to bring some kind of order in increasingly chaotic international environment, which is very much understandable and rational. But the question is how they do it. They do it, that's my view from Moscow, maybe completely wrong. But it seems that President Biden basically embraced the idea of President Trump administration about great power competition is the main trend in international affairs. But he tries to address it in a completely different way by introducing the ideological or the value component. And at the end, what he is trying to do is to reinstate the scheme of the Cold War, to have us versus them situation, much clearer picture of international competition with the free world on the one hand, on the one side, US plus allies and friends, and non-free world on the other side, Russia, China, plus somebody else maybe. Technically and instrumentally, I understand it very much. It's maybe even rational way, especially looking from the United States, because the Cold War ended up with American victory. But at the same time, I'm not sure it will work in today's world, because to imitate two blocks, two ideological blocks, may be possible, not easy, but possible. But to force countries to work as if there are ideological divisions in the world, I'm afraid it will not work, and it will, at the end of the day, produce more tensions inside both hypothetical blocks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lukyanov. I'm really sorry, Dr. Chen, but just because Dr. Haass has to leave in 12 minutes, we'll maybe come back to this question, but I would just like to I'd like to go to the fellows, the MSR fellows, and to ask in particular if they have any questions that they would like that are particularly designed for Dr. Haass before he leaves. If you do, please put up your hand and you can unmute yourself. Wonderful. So John, John, if you would like to unmute and ask your question, please.
All right. Yes. So thank you to all the panelists. This was a very interesting discussion, and we'll continue. So before Dr. Haass leaves, this is a question for all of you, but of course, Dr. Haass can address it first since he has to leave. So talking about this concept of great powers, I know the concept of Europe is usually romanticized, at least in the West, as this force of peace, long-standing peace, because the great powers were balanced and cooperating. Thinking in, the 21st century, the centers of power are much more geographically and culturally diverse. So thinking about how feasible first of all, would this actually be to have all of the great powers come together in a concert, in a unified concert, harmonious concert, if you will? And do you believe that such a concentrated and balanced multipolarity, so going back to Dr. Haass's point about the dispersal of power to non-state actors in the modern world, do you think if it was concentrated and balanced multipolarity among states, would that be able to create less hostile relations between, say the US and Russia, US and China, and just more generally lead to more widespread contentment and a sort of world community that Dr. Haass also referenced? Or would it lead to fractionalization?
Thank you very much, John. If I could ask the respondents to keep their answers reasonably brief so that we could take a second question as well, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Over to you.
John, thank you for raising it. Again, I suggest you read the original article in Foreign Affairs. It was about a month or two ago, and then there was a whole set of exchanges about it. And people raised some of the good points that you raised. I think the biggest question is whether there is sufficient ideological overlap or convergence between and among the major powers of the day, the United States, Russia, China, India, Japan, and Europe. There's not the degree there was during the concert of Europe. The question is whether there is sufficient agreement now. My view is I don't know, but it's worth exploring. And it doesn't include everybody. I think there's always a trade-off between inclusion and efficiency. So if you include a half dozen entities that together, represent more than 2/3, 3/4 of the world's power economically and militarily, it still leaves out significant others. So you involve them when they're relevant, just not as an automatic thing. So if you're going to discuss, say, Northeast Asia, you would want to have other countries, including those on the Korean Peninsula, involved in the conversation. It's not a club that's impermeable. But it's simply the idea was to introduce a device or an extra layer of a kind of steering group for the world at a time that the world does not seem to be driving down the road of stability very well, more likely to drive off it. So that's the idea. It's an experiment. And it's not based on ideology. The whole idea is a lot of, and as Fedor said, a lot of what's going on is based on ideology. And this basically said inclusion has nothing to do with ideology. That inclusion has to do with power and relevance. And that we have to, in some ways, accept China and Russia for their differences. They have to accept us. And again, we want to set certain ground rules on how we act, but we don't want the systemic differences between the countries to necessarily preclude their ability to cooperate on something like climate, which doesn't really care whether you're a democracy or an authoritarian system, or infectious disease. Doesn't really care about how you organize your markets. So that's the idea of this.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Haass. Is there anybody else who wants to quickly on the panel who would like to quickly come in on this point, or shall I move to the next question? Okay, I'll move to the next question. Tina, would you like to ask your question, please?
Thank you very much, Jade. Hello, everyone. My name is Tina McGlynn. I'm currently a student at the University of Oxford, and I'm very pleased to be here and ask my question towards you. I see Dr. Haass laughing. Yes, a fellow Oxfordian. I guess my question to you, directed to Dr. Haass, but anyone else on the panel. I think these ideas of Council of Europe have been flourishing for a while. But I just wonder, the challenges that we also have all depicted in the talks have also been pretty long-term, especially climate change, although it's only been now recognized more so. And I wonder why this cooperation, the incentive structure right now that's present in the world for cooperation, why did it let us all down, disappoint us in the face of such a global health crisis, such as COVID-19, obviously? And I just wonder, my question is, if a crisis such as COVID-19 did not help to change the incentive structure to make people, to make nations cooperate, is the incentives going to be, will respond to more so a gradual cooperation based on successes, or are we waiting for something else? I'm just wondering how we can start thinking about putting these ideas into reality.
I don't know if anybody else wants to take a shot at it. I'll just quickly say crises don't always generate effective responses. And the fact that crises come about in some ways reflects the fact that what existed beforehand was not adequate. We ought to have had better preparations for pandemics. It had been widely predicted. We didn't. And I think the problem is that a lot of governments are rather more short-sighted. They're more sensitive to domestic pressures. In my own country, there's not a lot of awareness of why the world matters and why foreign policy ought to be a priority. Just to take one example, there's a powerful argument on why we ought to be vaccinating the world, not simply for humanitarian reasons, but for our own self-interest. So variants do not break out, mutations of the virus, which then come back here, which is exactly what's happening. So you could argue that out of self-interest, in addition to humanitarian, in addition to economic interests, we ought to be doing more, but the answer is the world is not being vaccinated. And we're now talking about vaccination of the world will not be completed for at least another 18 months, if not longer. So that to me is it's a depressing example, a reflection of foreign policies that are not necessarily in self-interest, but it's very hard for leadership to generate domestic support because there's a sense of take care of us first, even though that contradicts one of the realities in a global world that we can no longer distinguish between them and us. But that requires some explanation. And I would just simply say that I think in many of our political systems, we haven't done a very good job about almost the education of our populace. We certainly don't in our country, about the importance of the world and how it affects us. So I think we're just paying a price. And also, I did one other thing. In certain crises, to the businessmen, if you read the business literature, if you go to business school, there's always a tension between the urgent and the important. And what often happens is things which are urgent crowd out things which are important. So something like climate change, which is a slow moving crisis, it's very hard at times to say we ought to be doing this because, well, we always have tomorrow to take care of it. Instead, today, we've got to worry about that. And the problem is by the time you wake up to it, all the good options are gone. And that's potentially our fate with climate change. We see the terrible tragedy in Florida with this building that collapsed. Well, the reason in part is because of raising water levels and also salt water getting into the air. So this is a perfect example. So the question is, will this change the way people, we'll see. But up to now, the fires in the West Coast, the floods in the center of the country, now this, it's not clear that even crises galvanize or generate responses.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haass, for your answer, and thank you, Tina, for your question. Sadly, I don't think we have enough time. Well, we have.
Do one more. We can do one more.
Okay, you've got time for one more. Okay,
Well,
I didn't want to be cheeky.
I just got a note. I got a note, so I can squeeze it in.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So, Marguerite, please, could I ask you to ask your question?
You're not from Oxford, too, are you?
I am actually.
It's not on purpose. I'm not on purpose only choosing the Oxonians, I promise.
You stacked the deck. Is there nobody from Cambridge? Nobody?
We got all excited. Yeah, no, it's just us. My name is Marguerite Chapman. Yep, also at Oxford. So rather than categorizing centers of influence according to regional powers, scholar Burke White, I believe, makes an interesting attempt to capture the increasing pluralism of the international system by identifying issue-specific hubs of influence. And this requires hubs to attract other states towards their subsystems rather than drawing by other means. And I was wondering, could such a conception be positive for the United States, this notion of attracting? And you mentioned, for example, that inclusion has to do with relevance. And others here have mentioned that global problems are no longer required of global solutions, or that issue-based coalition is the future. So I was wondering what you thought of that.
I'm not familiar with the hub thesis per se, but in general, this kind of ground up functionalism is happening. In trade, the most important agreements, say in Asia, CPTPP or RCEP, and in this part of the world, the USMCA, the whole European project. These are regional issues. On dealing with North Korea, there's a special coalition to deal with basically what we used to call contact groups. I don't see the phrase a lot anymore. With Iran, there's the equivalent of a six-party contact group. There's the Arctic Council. I would think that this is increasingly, again, it's informal or sometimes formalized coalitions of the sort of able, willing, and relevant. You got to be willing to participate. You got to have some capacity, and you got to matter. So I think that's already happening, and I think that's sort of the form of multilateralism we're most likely to see. In some areas it'll be effective, in some areas not. But I think that is pretty much the trend. I think it's a natural reaction to what we talked about before, with the shortcomings or limitations of what you might call grand or universal multilateralism. And the WTO is no longer the framework for negotiating trade agreements. The Doha round died. The WTO is useful as a legal adjudication mechanism, but it's no longer the driver of world trade. It remains to be seen whether Paris, how significant that will be. It's quite possible that Paris will be replaced or in importance, not by another global arrangement, but by trade agreements which place carbon taxes on items moving across borders. That might ultimately be more important, or by pressures domestically for countries and companies to change the way they do business. So I think we're moving towards that kind of a world of much more bottom-up arrangements that deal with particular challenges. I don't know if that fits the hub model, but I think that's the way we're moving. It's a very practical approach to things. It's less, if you will, ideological. It's less trying to force a certain perfect or archetypal response, and it's just much more practical.
Thank you, Marguerite, for your question, and thank you, Dr. Haass, for another wonderful answer, and indeed for sharing your thoughts with us on a really quite wide and expansive array of topics, and for being happy to answer so many questions. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you. It's great to join this class at Oxford today, and and I wish you all well. But really, seriously, there's so much talent on the screen, and so thank you. It's a great treat for me. You give me a lot to think about. And again, Vartan would have been pleased. So thank you, Anna. Thank you, Jade. And again, stay safe and well, everybody. But thank you for including me.
Thank you. Bye-bye. So now I'll move to the next question, which will go to the whole of the panel. I think the next question was from Sean, in terms of the order of the hands being put up. So Sean, I'm really hoping that you're not from Oxford. I feel like I should have learned the bios. Please ask your question.
No, I'm not. Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to all of the panel very much for a fascinating discussion. I'm a master's student at Harvard in the Russia Studies program. And my question is basically, I know no one really likes to make predictions, but sort of by the end of the century, do you think that liberal democracy as an idea will have lasting relevance both inside and outside the West? Thanks.
Would any panelist like to go forward, or should I ask a specific panelist?
Can I say a few words?
Oh, please do.
Yeah. Interesting question, though. This is a question many Chinese government officials and Chinese scholars have been grappling with. My own take on this is that you look around the world, we look at the natural world, we value biodiversity. You look at the United States, you value cultural and political diversity at home. So why would you expect that the world would be politically non-diverse? That is, the political world become very much like uniformity instead of diversity. This kind of argument may strike you as kind of strange, but I think, from a Chinese point of view, if we can have diversity at home in terms of political views, LGBT and others, multiculturalism, why would you expect something that is opposite in the international world? Why would you have liberal democracy everywhere? So I'm not answering question, but I'm kind of posing another question for you. But the question, I think, in fact, has the answer for you. That is, I don't believe I think it's neither desirable nor possible to have a world that is ruled by democracy and every country becomes a democracy. Political institutions and political values vary across countries because of history, language, geography, and other factors.
Thank you very much. More questions. I think it's that sort of topic, isn't it? But more questions there are leads to more questions. Dr. Gomart, you have your hand up. Would you like to respond to this question or perhaps the other questions raised by Dr. Xie?
Thank you, Jade. One comment in line with an observation in line with what was said by Richard before his departure. That's very interesting for me, this idea of having a sort of concert between China, the US, Russia, India, Japan, and Europe. We had previous discussion with Richard on that. What is fascinating for me is the fact that 4 of these so-called powers are aging powers. So China, Japan, Europe, and Russia, of course. And 2 are still dynamic in demographic terms, the US and India. But no a single word on Africa, which is certainly one of the most important area in the world. So I think that if we try to anticipate, great power competition, we should never forget this demographic dimension, and especially the fact that China is an aging power by comparison with India. And I think that certainly we should be de-Westernized to some extent and much more have much more attention on the relation between India and China. For me, that's certainly one of the biggest strategic issue for the future of this century. Now, the question of about democracy as a model outside the so-called West. First of all, I would say one thing. Certainly there is something which was learned during the last 2 decades. It is that you have very reluctant countries which want to defend their so-called specificity, for instance, for Russia. And certainly it was something completely underestimated, by the West after the end of the Cold War. There is one single country in which there is a continuity in terms of ideology, in terms of organization between the Cold War and the current situation. It is China. That's an observation. And second, I think now we have to explain also to our Chinese, Russian colleagues that we do intend to defend our model as they defended their model previously. So my answer is to say that certainly democracy will be much more on the defensive, but will be defended. Second, third point, I think also, what do we understand, democracy or liberal democracy? For me, of course, you have election, you have pluralism, you have these sort of things, but what is the more important in my view, and it is a question of efficiency, it is separation of powers, between what is executive power, judicial power, legislative power. And this separation is at the core of our difference, given the fact that on the other side, you have a fusion of power, which is certainly good to be authoritarian, but less good to adapt to situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gomart. Dr. Lukyanov, if you would like to go over, sorry, and then after that, Dr. Chen, I will come to you if that's okay.
Yeah, just one sentence to what Thomas just said. I think democracy, liberal democracy, has the more chances to survive and to remain one of leading forms of statecraft and organization of society, the less it will be used as geopolitical instrument and political instrument in this competition of great powers. Because it's very destructive for liberal democracy to become an instrument of expansion of whoever will do it. So I think that, of course, and I agree very much with the Chinese colleague, that the world will be very much heterogeneous, and we can expect all possible forms to flourish, but all of them, not just some of them, which will be seen as universally necessary and acceptable.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lukyanov. And then, sorry, Dr. Chen, if you would like to speak.
Thank you. With regard to the question about the liberal democracy, I think I would echo the points my Chinese colleague, Professor Xie, has already raised. But I want to add that if we refer those liberal democracy as a kind of a value, I think that those values such as democracy or freedom would still be highly appreciated among many people, including those people in China. What those mainstream of Chinese academy would reject or oppose is kind of so-called a one-size-fits-all model of a political institution, which believe that only such kind of a specific model will apply to all countries, whether it has a unique a cultural tradition and a stage of economic development. So this is my point, that we appreciate the value and we believe that those values will continue to survive, but we do not believe that there's a one-size-fits-all mode of a system. As my colleagues, the Russian colleagues say, that the diversity is the beautiful one thing. My second point is, we do observe that those liberal democracy systems in quite a number of advanced economies, including the United States and some European countries, have some problems, have their problems. But I believe those kind of problems should be addressed or should through the undergoing reform of your own. What to my concern is some politicians, some political figures, they try to use those exclusionary rhetoric or policy by blaming others for their own country's troubles or their own ineffective provincial approach to inherently transnational problems. So I think that's wrong. And I think during the Trump administration, they tried to, blame others, including China, for Americans' own problems. That's the problem. My last point is, because we have talked about the so-called big power, great power competition. The reality is that despite of the so-called power shifting or distribution or rising competition, the interdependence is still the biggest reality. And we need to frame the big power relationship in the narrative of competitive interdependence or competitive co-evolution or competitive cooperation. So I think that instead of focusing on a strategic competition or even flaming up the ideological confrontation between big powers, the narrative of so-called great power politics need to build around build around the key question, that is, what are the common challenges facing us? And how can big powers work together to work out a global solutions to those global challenges, those threats. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting answer, as are all the answers. I think next, just so that we have enough time, I'm going to take 3 questions together, but I also wanted to check, Connor, whether or not, because you kindly sent in your question beforehand, I wondered whether you would be so kind as to read out your second question, and perhaps we can take that as well. Would that be okay, Connor?
Yes, it would. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Do you want to? Why didn't you say it now, and then I'll go to Alex and Lucy, and then hopefully at the time we'll have at the end we'll have time for Sophie's question as well.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. I just want to quickly thank the panelists. It's been a really interesting discussion. My name is Connor Cunningham. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Washington in Seattle, where it is currently close to 100 degrees. My question was, does the argument that smaller nations do not have full sovereignty have any merit? And what place should smaller nations play in the newly emerging geopolitical struggle between world superpowers? Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you, Connor. And now I'm just going to come to Alex's question, and then we'll take them as a group, as a trio.
Thank you, and thank you to all the panelists. My name is Alex Carlier. I'm a major in the U.S. Army and a student of international policy at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. My question is about how we've discussed multilateralism as an approach for making some progress on some global issues instead of global solutions for some of these global problems. For any of the panelists, do you see limits to multilateralism, and can you discuss those or any insights about what those limits could be? Thinking specifically about trade, if we go away from the World Trade Organization, will it even cease to exist as a way to resolve disputes globally if we completely go away from working on these international institutions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. And then Lucy, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Thanks, Jade, and thanks to all the speakers. I'll introduce myself very quickly. I'm a PhD candidate in Russian Studies at the University of Manchester. My question is kind of related to Alex's. A few of the speakers have alluded to or explicitly mentioned the kind of inadequacy of these supranational organizations and institutions like the WHO in dealing with crises. And I wonder if, given that a lot of the UN as well and the EU, coupled with the kind of waning trust in them, I'm wondering if we were to produce or create new institutions that could negotiate and attempt to deal with these global crises that also try to take into account the kind of the new nature of international order and multipolarity, whether that might be a better way to try and deal with some of these crises on the one hand, and also whether that could in turn foster greater engagement between some of the big powers like China and Russia and the US. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. It's a really interesting question. Sophie, is your question on a related topic, or is it on a different topic?
Not very much related.
Okay, we'll come to it at the end then, because I think these 3 go in quite neatly together. Okay, so just to sort of remind everybody, Connor's question is about the role that small nations can play in multilateral order, and then Alex asks about the limits to multilateralism, and then Lucy asks, would it be best to almost start from scratch to create new institutions for the new world order? Would any of the panelists like to put themselves first to start on these questions? Dr. Lukyanov, can I pick? Oh, okay, Dr. Chen has saved you, Dr. Lukyanov.
Okay, yeah, let me try, because all those questions are very important, but it's very tough. As I said at the very early beginning, that we are not living in an ideal world with a global government. And we have to live with the reality of so-called competitive interdependence. And we need a global solution or global governance. Ideally speaking, I think that it requires a kind of a mixture of all those international institutions, regional organizations, civil societies organizations, or multi-stakeholders, one entrepreneur communities work together in a more coordinated way, but actually it does not. So I think that we have to strike the balance of efficacy, legitimacy, and solidarity. And I agree with some of my panelists' view that not everything needs all members working together, because it is unnecessary and it is also impossible. So I think that in that regard, a big country, a big power requires more responsibility. So when we talk about the concept of power, big powers, it means that all those big powers, despite of their differences ideologically or different interests, they need to ask themselves, what is the biggest common challenge facing us? And whether or likely that they can shelving those differences politically while working together on the common agenda, inclusive development, the emerging technologies disruptive effect, and as well as many other multilateral issues, transnational issues. The second one is, I think United Nations still play an important role because it is the most, still it is the most comprehensive and representative international organization. But the challenge is that how to make United Nations to work more coordinatedly with other multi-stakeholders. And in that regard, I think that on one side, we need to continue to stress the so-called equal the equality among all the members. But at the same time, I also believe that issue-oriented coalition with a more capability and responsible, as well as a highly interested one, they should play a more important role in shaping or play a kind of a driving force behind of those multilateral movement. And that all requires, I think, that the importance of consensus building among those key players. So the more powerful the countries or community or countries or entrepreneurs or those civil societies, the more contributions they should pay to those movements of multilateralism. And so I think that we have to live with those reality, because there's no so-called ideal multilateralism. But those issue-oriented coalition, they should work together as a complementary. We should particularly reject those ideology-based confrontation and those club or exclusively club of coalition, which focus too much on the ideology, while exclude those key players which can contribute, but because of the differences of ideology has made those cooperation impossible. So I will stop here.
Thank you, and thank you for laying out your thoughts so clearly on really what was a set of quite complex questions. Would any other of the panelists care to add their answers, or shall I move on? Dr. Gomart, please.
Quickly, the question from Kono on smaller countries. You have a prototype, you know, in terms of multilateralism and respect of small countries. And sorry to defend my home, I would say, but that's the EU. Precisely, the idea of the EU is to give the same importance to each country. So you have 27 countries, you know, with a very sophisticated institutional arrangements, but each country is as important as the others. So it's very often easy to blame or to criticize the EU, especially when you are seated in Moscow at the time being. But I think that the EU should be also regarded as a political prototype in terms of multilateralism. And this prototype could be interesting for other regional organizations. And only the fact that to be able to create a consensus, it's difficult, it takes time. It's democratic way of functioning. But I think it deserves to be observed and to be respected from the outside. Second, the question about limits of multilateralism. I think it was said many times by some of us. It is this notion of inclusive multilateralism. Certainly, there is a confusion made between multilateralism as a mean, a diplomatic mean, and multilateralism as a hand. I think that many countries over the world are afraid of the evolution of the relation between China and the US. A much more assertive China and the US, which is redressing its international exposure, but which has also so strong abilities. And in fact, I think that the vast majority of the countries in the world do not want to be trapped by this rivalry between China and the US. So for Europeans, we are allies to the US because we share joint values and democratic system. But also we are very careful about, this rivalry between the two bigs. And I think, by the way, that's the biggest challenge for Russia, the more and more asymmetrical relation between China and Russia. I stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gomart. I'm now going to go to Sophie, so we have time for Sophie's question as well, then we fit everybody in. Please, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Jade. My name is Sophie. I'm an MPhil student at Oxford University as well, so we close with Oxonians again. Sorry for that. I would like to thank Dr. Gomart for bringing the EU to the table, because that was exactly what I was intending to do in my question. So my question relates to what some of the speakers refer to as the growing rivalry between China and the US with regards to going green as a new form of capitalism. And I wanted to mention or bring to the table the EU's European Green Deal, introduced by Commission President von der Leyen in 2019. And indeed, very competitively, von der Leyen stated when she first introduced the deal that the European Green Deal would be Europe's man on the moon moment, and the plan would make Europe the first climate neutral continent. So my question to the panelists would really be, what would be the role of the EU in this rivalry between China and the US with regard to the introduction of green capitalism, since the EU very much sees itself as the forerunner in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Any panelists like to speak on this question? Dr. Gomart? Oh, sorry, you do have your hand raised. I thought it was from before. Please go ahead.
I think that's a very, very important question. Thank you very much, Sophie, for raising it. China goes green. There is a very good book I advise you to read by Shapiro on that. And that's important, I think, seated in Europe to understand this move. In fact, you have this notion of ecological civilization, which is actively promoted by Chinese authorities. It is now in the Chinese constitution. It is very often said that China wants to be at the front, of decarbonation, neutrality, also to defend climate justice and so on. That's very important, and it was said by President Xi Jinping, in last September. Having said that, I think it cannot be understood without two key points. The first one, it is the fact that, indeed, China invests massively on decarbonation and wants to be the leader for all the technology in terms of decarbonation, but simultaneously invest also massively on coal plants everywhere in the world. So you have this contradiction, which is a very major one. And the second contradiction, in my opinion, the so-called environmental civilization promoted by the Chinese authorities cannot be understood without a complete system of supervision, of collective supervision and individual supervision, with all its application in terms of social credits. So the big issue, in fact, for the other part of the world, it is to go green, but to respect also their values and their political systems. And that's the main challenge for the Green Deal you have mentioned, Sophie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gomart, and Dr. Lukyanov, if you would like to answer as well. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add, first of all, I humbly disagree with my old friend Thomas Gomart when he said that EU should serve as a prototype for international structures defending small countries and formulating collective interests. I'm absolutely sure that a European integration experience is unique. It cannot be replicated anywhere else in the world because situation in Eurasia or Latin America or in South Asia, it's completely different and history is different. So hopefully the European integration model will overcome current problems inside and work in Europe, continue work in Europe, but it's certainly not the way how to address other regions' problems. And as for the Green Deal, I think we should be very much aware that the Green Deal, as Chinese going green policy, as the US green policy, as anybody else's, Russia hopefully will formulate as well. That's about who will set standards, international standards in this field. And this is highly competitive and highly electrified area. And this is struggle for leadership and actually even for hegemony. So in this regard, as I mentioned in my initial introduction, this is a global problem with climate. All of us need to think how to address it, but it's not anything which can unify people, which can unify countries and states. It's exactly the opposite.
Thank you, Dr. Lukyanov. And on that actually quite important note of disagreement, I'm afraid it's my sad privilege to bring the keynote discussion to an end. I would like to thank all of the speakers, Dr. Haass, who's already left, Dr. Gomart, Dr. Lukyanov, Dr. Chen, Dr. Xie, for their fascinating answers to a very wide array of complex questions. And also I'd like to thank all of the fellows for attending, and also those fellows who asked some really thought-provoking questions. It's been such a rich discussion, and I think it was nice actually to have that note of disagreement at the end. It sort of brings us back to what we spoke about at the start, and that importance of coming around and having these productive disagreements and arguing it out in an academic and polite way, of course, as everybody thankfully has done here. So on that note, thank you to everybody from me, and goodbye. Nice to meet you.